Hello everyone again. On behalf of the Organizing Committee and Applied Anthropology Network, I welcome you to the 8th Symposium, which explore the world of applications of anthropology beyond the traditional academia, why the world needs anthropologists mobilizing the planet digitally. In our 2020 online edition, we set out to explore both critically and practically the potential of online mobilization tools for social movements and digital activism. My name is Marie, and I'm a member of the organizing committee, and I will also act as a content support today. So I will be with you in the chat during the whole session. I will be collecting your questions, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any issues or problems. We also have Pavel and Petra here with us acting as tech support. So if you have any issues, please drop a question in the chat and they will be on it. And now I pass the word to the session moderator, Mina Baginova. Mina, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Maria. Hello, everyone. Good morning from Prague, from my side. I'm really happy to welcome you and our great speakers on our roundtable on digital activism. We are just, as it goes with Zoom, we are a little bit limited with time. So I will keep this introduction super short. You are in real treat here today, because not only you will hear on how the far right mobilizes on the internet, you will also get the tips from our speakers on how you can mobilize digitally. So I don't think we will try to collect also all your questions that you might have in our chat. And well, without any further delay, I will give a word to our first speaker, who is Alex Khasnabish. Welcome. Alex is a professor at the Mount Saint Vincent University in Halifax. And he is also, apart from many things, he is also the author of What Moves Us, The Lives and Times of Radical Imagination. So Alex, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mina. Thank you everyone for being here. Thanks for the invitation to speak this morning. I'm going to get right to it. My talk is entitled Nazi Making Machines, Digital Infrastructure and the New Fascism. Last weekend, as I was preparing, Last weekend, as I was preparing for this talk about online neo-fascism and online digital cultures, my partner received an unexpected text message from a friend. Accompanied by very little text, the message contained two links, one a YouTube video and the other a WordPress blog. Both were titled QAnon, Learn to Read the Map, and promised to reveal the truth behind the New World Order and its globalized, organized corruption networks. For those unfamiliar with the QAnon phenomenon, it's an internet-born conspiracy theory centered on a cabal of globalist satanic elites, running a transnational pedophile ring and mobilizing the formidable power of the deep state. Standing against this shadowy network is the presidency of Donald Trump, who, we are told, is preparing to bring down this satanic house of cards and sweep away the degradation and debris of this corrupt New World Order. Q is supposedly a US government insider with the highest level security clearance. While my partner and I debated what constituted an appropriate and meaningful response to the sender, I was simultaneously struck by the serendipitous timing and utter banality of the moment. Here I was, thinking through the structure of a presentation about the way neo-fascists and white supremacists were mobilizing digital infrastructure in order to advance their culture war and build a new politics up to the task of delivering their longed-for white ethno-state, only to find myself ensnared in one of its stickiest webs. As it turned out, the text was sent mistakenly, and this friend was not, in fact, trying to groom my partner to become a follower of Q. Nevertheless, the exchange highlighted just how digital communicative infrastructure has facilitated the circulation of far-right ideas, notably in the absence of any direct physical encounters with other activists and organizers. We've come a long way since the early days of the internet when, in the early 1980s, neo-Nazis and white supremacists used the first computer bulletin board systems to network with each other. But to focus on the infrastructure in many ways takes our attention away from what are some of the most important implications of this new era of neo-fascist, far-right, and white supremacist organizing. The development of a globe-spanning digital communication infrastructure, and particularly social media platforms, has been capitalized on by a new generation of far-right actors committed to a metapolitics and fighting and winning the culture war. Metapolitics and culture war fighting need to be understood not as ends in themselves for neo-fascists, the far-right and white power activists, but as a necessary threshold for the establishment of the white ethno-state. In what follows, I aim to sketch some of the contours of this struggle and the routes it travels, with a focus on its North American presence. The work is very much one in progress, so my conclusions are admittedly preliminary and partial, but also a stark reminder of the importance of bringing social research to bear on this urgent and alarming phenomenon. It's worth defining the terms of reference before delving in any further. While I consider a constellation of neo-fascist and white supremacist movements here, these movements are distinct in our current crisis-ridden moment. It is particularly important to be precise about what we mean by fascism. Eminent historians of fascism, Robert Paxton and Roger Griffin, have much to say about this, but here I reference the heart of their respective definitions. Paxton describes fascism as, quote, a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion, end quote. Griffin defines fascism as, quote, a genus of political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism, end quote. Palingenesis refers to rebirth or recreation, so another way of putting this in slightly more familiar terms might be a revolutionary form of populist ultranationalism. While fascism has never been entirely absent since its public emergence in the 1920s, the last decade has seen a dramatic global resurgence of fascist activity. If, as Federico Finkelstein argues, it is true that populism is fascism's heir in the post-war liberal democratic, for some, epoch, then fascist inroads are even more significant. This trend seems to only be increasing with greater temporal distance from the horrors of World War II and the Nazis' final solution. Post-war fascism in North America has been deeply influenced by the European New Right, and this is where the emphasis on metapolitics comes from. Leaning heavily on Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony, this perspective disavows, for the time being at least, the vanguardist or paramilitary and mainstreaming or political engagement iterations of far-right politics in favor of concentrating on intellectual and cultural production to overcome the spiritual, material, and racial degradation they attribute to this version of modernity. Speaking a confounding and well-camouflaged language of diversity through separation, this much more erudite white power rhetoric advances a vision of ethno-pluralism that nevertheless is steeped in a hatred of the other. In the words of Roger Griffin, quote, it insists on the human right to belong to a distinctive, historically rooted, mythically conceived as ideally homogeneous and pure, one which is uncontaminated by the mass migration and globalization encouraged by the liberal democratic commitment to pluralism. Democracy is portrayed as a new totalitarianism which promotes cultural genocide, end quote. As I explore shortly, this strategy has proven particularly effective and prolific in the thoroughly capitalized and profit-directed social media ecology. Advancing a metapolitical strategy that concretely takes the form of the endless, exhausting, and performative culture wars we have become seemingly resigned to does not mean fascists and other members of the far right have abandoned either vanguardist or mainstreaming positions. If anything, far-right activity over the last decade demonstrates a blending of strategic and tactical choices that have blurred the lines between different fronts of struggle. This is perhaps nowhere more frighteningly or starkly illustrated than the rash of lone wolf mass murders carried out by white supremacists, whose radicalization appears to have occurred mainly or exclusively online, and whose murderous actions were amplified and recirculated online. In Shitposting, Inspirational Terrorism, and the Christchurch Mosque Massacre, Journalist Robert Evans examines the role of shitposting in the circulation of white supremacist and fascist ideas online. Evans describes shitposting as, quote, the act of throwing out huge amounts of content, most of it ironic, low-quality trolling, for the purpose of provoking emotional reaction in less internet-savvy viewers, end quote, with the ultimate goal of derailing meaningful discussion and distracting readers. Evans explores the Christchurch mosque killer's radicalization in a highly anonymous, atomized, and internet-mediated way, as well as his attempt to inspire more acts of white power terror by live streaming his massacre on Facebook and posting his manifesto to Twitter. Evans has also examined what he terms the gamification of white power terrorism, a trend manifested on image boards like 8chan, where posters express a desire to beat the high score of other mass murderers and adopt other aesthetic elements borrowed from gamer culture, including the live streaming of massacres by white power killers in the style of first-person shooters. In many ways, these trends represent a dramatic and disturbing acceleration of the dynamics of radicalization and extremist activity on the far right and have set the stage for resurgent fascism. The communicative logics of the thoroughly capitalized space of the internet have only added fuel to this fire. In 1983, Ku Klux Klansman and white power guru Louis Beam penned his essay Leaderless Resistance in the Interclan newsletter. In it, Beam sketched out a new vision for white power activism and militancy comprised of clandestine, autonomous cells of dedicated cadre committed entirely to the white power struggle and willing to, quote, utterly destroy the movement's enemies, end quote. Responding to the state's effective attacks on centralized, formal, above-ground movement organizations on both the left and the right, Beam was among the vanguardist wing of the white power movement in the United States, who advocated for this vision of leaderless resistance and lone wolf insurgency. Beam's call would ultimately help usher in an age of white power terrorism in the US and Canada that has accounted for 3/4 of domestic terror killings over the last decade and spawned such infamous white power terror groups as The Order. Louis Beam would also innovate the use of the gestating internet in the early 1980s in support of white power activism. Tom Metzger with White Aryan Resistance in 84 and 85, and Louis Beam with Aryan Liberty Net in 84 used computer bulletin board systems several years before the internet became a social phenomenon. Stormfront was the first real North American movement website, established in 1994 by Don Black, former Ku Klux Klan leader. While it's commonly the Zapatista uprising in January 1994 that gets linked with the birth of a new electronic fabric of communication and resistance, it's worth noting that white power activists were mobilizing the same infrastructure for their own purposes a decade earlier. But so very much has changed with respect to the reach and intensity of the internet's communicative capacity since then. In February 2015, Lindsay Savannarath, James Gamble, and Randall Shepard, 3 disaffected, alienated neo-Nazi 20-somethings, were foiled in their attempt to carry out a Valentine's Day massacre at a mall in Halifax, Canada. They chose the mall as a target because it represented consumerism, greed, and degradation, and provided abundant potential victims. Tipped off to the plot, Canadian law enforcement arrested Savannarath and Shepard at the airport when Savannarath arrived from the US. Gamble killed himself in his home in a suburb outside of Halifax when police arrived to arrest him. The 3 met and hatched their mass murder-suicide plot on Tumblr, bonding over their love of Nazi imagery, National Socialism, and the Columbine School massacre, among other things. As journalist Mac Lamoureux notes, quote, the role the internet played in this crime cannot be overstated. Online, they were able to meet through Columbine jokes, indulge in their darkest fantasies, and plan a mass shooting on a messaging app, end quote. I juxtapose Beam's and Savannarath and Gamble's stories here because I think they represent very different yet fundamentally connected visions of leaderless resistance. Beam advances a dedicated cadre guerrilla-style struggle model compared to Savannarath and Gamble's nihilistic death cult, but both are manifestations of far-right terror set in the cultural context of their respective moments. What the internet makes possible is a scale and intensity of engagement through media not possible in traditional formats. Just like leftists, the far right has always made use of a variety of social media to spread ideas and forge connections, from book fairs to conferences, broadsheets to zines, culture production, and more. Nevertheless, Internet-based communication, and especially social media platforms, have facilitated a level of penetration into the fabric of daily life and a degree of intensity in terms of participation and effective engagement that far surpasses previous media paradigms. Gavin Titley assesses the state of play in our current moment presciently, noting, quote, "The internet and digital media are deeply ambivalent. The partial reordering of media gatekeeping and the reduction of significant barriers to entry have certainly engendered somewhat more pluralized public cultures, and the network dynamics of speed and circulation have extended the capacities of anti-racist counterpublics to respond, critique, and organize. And through the incessant industrial production of speech, news, opinion, commentary, images, and memes, space for the circulation and amplification of racist repertoires is vastly increased," end quote. A densely populated digital media ecology inhabited by corporate entities driven exclusively by profit-making has furnished seemingly endless opportunities for the weaponization of free speech in the service of fascist and far-right agendas. Recent action taken by YouTube and Facebook against QAnon and Holocaust denial aside, these platforms have for years served as what Robert Evans has called Nazi-making machines, leading, as they do, consumers of their media down ever more extreme rabbit holes in order to keep people watching. What is particularly striking about these dynamics is that what would previously have required a potential movement recruit to actually go out into the world, physically encounter other movement members, attend meetings, occupy public space with all its attendant risks, and expend time and energy, has now been replaced by much lower investment costs, at least initially. Digital infrastructure makes dabbling in neo-Nazism, white supremacy, and fascism much more anonymous, casual, and low cost than it would have been previously. In 2017, Metapedia, Stormfront, and the Daily Stormer were at the forefront of cyber-fascism in North America. Since then, and perhaps especially in the age of the coronavirus pandemic, social media platforms such as Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter have come under increasing scrutiny for their role in platforming white supremacy and fascism. In Blood and Politics, his tour de force account of white power politics in the United States since the 1970s, Leonard Zeskin took stock of a new generation of white power activists coming of age in the early 2000s. His observations were prescient and bear quoting at length. Quote, "The generations after the post-war boomers have yet to fully take the stage. From this juncture, those now 20 plus years old will determine the future directions of the white nationalist movement. They are tech-savvy and well-educated. Having not lived through World War II, they will not be chastened by the horrors of Hitlerism. Having never experienced Jim Crow and the struggles against it, they will be unburdened by its memory. Their only uniform will be their white skins in a country where white people are increasingly a demographic minority among minorities. The prerogatives now accruing to majority status will be challenged as black, brown, and yellow faces increasingly populate the halls of economic and political power. The presidency of Barack Obama only confirms their notions of white dispossession. And in the decades to come, the next generations of activists will seek to establish a white nation state with definable economic, political, and racial borders out of the wreckage they hope to create of the United States. Some will kill and bomb and shoot their supposed racial enemies. Some will run for elected office and win. They will fight for local white control. Failing a complete victory, they will continue the cultural battle over symbols from the past and the history of the future, and they will draw on the legacy of those who resurrected white supremacy as an autonomous movement in the 1970s and brought it into the 21st century," end quote. We're in the midst of this cultural battle, but it certainly feels as though we are on the precipice tipping toward outright fascism. Across the overdeveloped capitalist North, the sure sensibility that mature democracies were inoculated against fascism has evaporated in the face of overlapping crises and the inherent limits of bourgeois liberal democracy. This is a critical juncture that a rigorous, nimble, social justice-oriented social science practice can usefully intervene in. Understanding the dynamics of white dispossession and radicalization in digital spaces seems critical to addressing the looming threat of a deep-seated sense of white grievance being fanned into outright boogaloo, or, to use an older term from the white power movement, racial holy war. Contemporary moral panics over perceived attacks on freedom of speech are a fitting index of the amplification of far-right paranoia by capitalist social media corporate entities. As Gavin Titley incisively observes, quote, "The narrow fixations of viewpoint diversity advocacy illustrate how racialized knowledge can be recuperated as an exercise in free thinking. Ideas that sought to shape human relations in the world and have been politically repudiated in that world are laundered as thought experiments that increase the reasonable plurality of the public sphere. With racism repudiated and closure achieved on its meaning, everything can and should be open and opened again and again, end quote. These are precisely the dynamics that have been mobilized in defense of white supremacy and in support of neo-fascist positions. As if we are trapped in an endless cycle, we are compelled to debate every dehumanizing, oppressive, exploitative proposition as if it were a neutral or novel phenomenon. Critical social research has contributed to exposing these toxic dynamics. Surely we can hope that it is capable of contributing to a future beyond them. Thank you for paying attention to this talk. That brings me to the end.
Excellent, Alex. Thank you so much for your fascinating presentation. We can now move on to John Postill, who is with us from Melbourne, and I think it'll be a really nice transition from what Alex has just been talking about. So let me welcome John Postill from the RMIT University. Hi, John.
Hi everyone. Thanks a lot for the invite. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you, and the floor is yours.
Good. 20 minutes, I believe.
Yes, please. Yes.
All right. So I'll try and fit it into 20 minutes. My approach is very different. My paper, I hope, will complement Alex's in that I'm coming from a very different research site. The title of my talk is The Making of a Liberal Anti-Woke Public, liberal in inverted commas, a digital ethnography. This is early days. I only just started in May looking at how certain activists who generally call themselves liberal or in favor of liberal democracy, how they are reacting to recent events in the US and the UK mostly, following from the killing of George Floyd, and how they see themselves as trying to create an opposition or a resistance to what they regard as a woke, as a critical social justice, critical race theory, invasion almost of the institutions across the US and the UK. So the argument, what I want to do is start sketching the making of this public and how it's accelerated in recent months. The reason I think it's important that we do this kind of research is that it's not either extreme. It's not what we often pay more attention to, which is the far right. And it's coming from a complicated place because they're trying to find some kind of a third way, if I can use that old term. And it turns out to be, from my preliminary findings, it turns out to be quite a visible transmedia interracial space where politically moderate public figures, mostly in American Britain, as I say, and many of them writers, journalists, academics, and comedians, congregate to critique and denounce what they call critical social justice or wokeism, wokeness. It comes by many different names. And they do so in the name of liberal democracy, freedom of speech, science, reason, and so on. You'll recognize some of them from the so-called new atheist movement in some cases. Others are well-known public figures. But there are many layers to this public. In terms of the ranking, there's huge variations, as I'll explain in a moment. Okay, so let me start with who these people are and what it is that they want. Well, I've just mentioned they are mostly writers, journalists, academics, and comedians. I've done a little ranking of some of the people I've been following in terms of Twitter followers. So it ranges from From the very top, number one is, as you might have expected, Ricky Gervais, obviously at almost, let me see if I can find the figure here. I can't find the figure. I believe it's something around 13 million followers, 13 million followers on Twitter. Then people like J.K. Rowling, Stephen Fry, Bill Maher, Piers Morgan, Richard Dawkins, Jordan Peterson, who is obviously not very active these days, Bill Burr, the comedian. Among those top 9 public figures, they have over 70 million followers on Twitter. And that's without counting all the other platforms, mainstream media where they operate. The top 3 are from the UK. It's mostly men. Out of those 9, 8 of them are men. And then when you look at the middle regions, when you look at those of these publics, so-called anti-woke, the people I'm calling the anti-woke public figures, then you have quite a number of them. There are something like 38 or 39 in the 100K to 1 million followers on Twitter. And they are more diverse. This middle region is more diverse in terms of gender, race. It's more USA as opposed to the UK domination of the top, some of those top 9. And they tend to be a bit younger than the top 9 public figures that I've just mentioned. How do they denounce wokeism or wokeness, to use some of the words? Some of them call it a religion, a cult, a divisive ideology that threatens to undermine the US, the West, divide the UK, liberal democracy. Okay, how does this public work in terms of the digital platforms and the practices? In terms of the platforms, Twitter is very much the hub, and then around Twitter, it's almost like an archipelago of platforms. And we have those who have their own channel, particularly at the middle regions I'm talking now. They have their own podcast or YouTube channel. Some of them are from independent magazines like Quillette, Spiked, Aereo, and other magazines like that, Transatlantic in some cases. They also operate, many of them are through mainstream media, radio, television, and so on. Other social media, not quite as important as those platforms that I've mentioned. And sometimes, although now under COVID, less so at the moment, there's some face-to-face interaction among these middle region operators in particular. So this is what Chadwick calls a hybrid media system, where those who have the ability to connect across social media and the legacy media, so-called legacy media, tend to acquire a larger followership. And it's also very important to remark, it operates on multiple temporalities. It's not just the fast-moving, short tweeting that we tend to think of. Because of podcasting and YouTube channels, what happens is that there are these lengthy conversations going on, but generally within an echo chamber, within there's a reciprocity agreement whereby they visit one another's podcast or channel or magazine, and sometimes they play the role of a host, sometimes of a guest. So you tend to come across over time the same usual suspects, so to speak, operating in these scenes. In terms of Twitter practices, you have tweeting with comment. Retweeting is not that common because generally they want to add their comment to what they are sharing. There's obviously some liking. There's a lot of book promotion. Many of these people are promoting their latest book, and there's other forms of self-promotion. And among the many Twitter practices, I would single out a few of them. I would single out, for example, what we might call, following Victor Turner, arena making. It's when you interpolate directly someone, you tweet and you put their name in because you want them to be part of that controversy or that discussion that you're having. This can be foes or friends, or it can be both. You try and bring them into the controversy, see what they have to say about it. It doesn't always work. Often people will stay away, people from the other side will stay away from that controversy, but you do have some boundary crossing and some border clashes as well. Then there's quite a bit of sharing of so-called receipts going on. Receipts are those screenshots that people take when there's been a deleted tweet or some deleted, erased digital content. Someone will bring it back and share it and say, this is what you're trying to conceal from us. There's also hashtag promotion. It's a very lively hashtag environment, of course, and some of these public actors will promote certain hashtags and try and get their followers and their allies to join in. There's trolling going on, there's mocking of your perceived enemy and other practices. So beyond Twitter, as I say, there's lots of what we might call channel hopping, that visiting that I described earlier, this circulation of people around. You might call it, I scratch your anti-work back, you scratch mine. And it's largely convivial, friendly competition and cooperation over prestige and reputation in this space. Okay, I have 3 very quick case studies, and I've got 8 minutes. I'm going to try and touch on 3 case studies I've been following. The first study I'm calling for now Centering Black History, and it's Project 1619 by the New York Times Magazine. It was launched in 2019 by an African-American journalist, Nicole Hannah Jones, and it was intended to mark the 400th anniversary of the arrival of slaves in Virginia. There was a line in the launching of this project that said, 1619 is our true founding. And this line caused a lot of controversy. Now, a lot of the initial controversy around this was driven by the World Socialist website, a Trotskyist website that took issue with what they regarded to be reframing the attention to the historical construction of the US from class to race. They objected to that. They interviewed a number of historians, and that generated quite a lot of discussion online via Twitter and other platforms. A number of historians, left and right, criticized the project. Nevertheless, it won a Pulitzer Award, and it was praised by Kamala Harris. It recently got a New York University Journalism Award as well. So huge controversy. The anti-woke people I've been following, they like to call it hashtag 1619gate. And what happened is that eventually the New York Times Magazine quietly deleted the offending sentence and sent it down the memory hole, as the anti-wokes would put it. James Lindsay, for example, kept some of the receipts, some of the deleted other people kept deleted content and shared it. So it's an example of the kind of disputes that are going on around the reframing of American history. Eventually, the whole thing reached Donald Trump, who in September, i.e. last month, tweeted, as you'd expect, he tweeted about it, and he tweeted that he was, that the Department of Education was following very closely, investigating the state of California for teaching this Project 1619 in the public school system, and they would withhold federal funding if that actually went ahead. So as you can see, quite a journey from the World Socialist website to the White House. My second case study, very quickly, I'm calling for the time being racist white people. And this was initiated by a conservative filmmaker, a writer, policy researcher named Chris Rufo, who calls himself a social liberal and a fiscal conservative. And it started with a leak in Seattle, where someone within the government said, well, we're being trained, there's this racially segregated training going on, targeting whiteness, targeting so-called internalized racism. And the aim of the training sessions for these white federal employees was to interrupt the whiteness and the white privilege, I'm quoting. More leaks followed, and Chris Rufo has made a name for himself in recent months for what we might call WikiLeaks, not so much WikiLeaks as WikiLeaks, from across the federal government, people feeding him information about this critical race theory training, including sites like the Treasury Department, the Homeland Security, Sandia National Labs, who are responsible for the nuclear arsenal, the FBI, and so on. Now, Rufo went on television, more specifically, he went on Fox News and directly interpolated Donald Trump and said the president had to do something about this. Lo and behold, a few days later, Trump tweeted that he was actually executing, as requested by Chris Rufo, this researcher, he was executing an executive order to end, in quotes, cult indoctrination in the federal government. If you go to the White House website, they have the executive order there. It makes for quite an interesting read. And the order was, I quote, it's an EO, an executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. As always in this kind of scene, Martin Luther King is quoted, and the idea that it being that they are rejecting Trump and his administration are rejecting this different vision of America based on collective identities and not, I quote, on the equal dignity of every person as an individual. So as you can see, quite a lot of activity across different domains. Finally, very quickly, my third example is, I'm calling it for now, Stemming the Asian Tide, and it has to do with Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology in Virginia, where Asra Nomani, a single mother who has a son in the school and who comes from a journalistic and academic background, she's of Indian Muslim background, has started a campaign to try and put a stop to what she calls the bringing of critical race theory into the K-12 school system by stealth, in which the plan at the state level is to create a so-called merit lottery, whereby more Hispanic and African American students will will go to this particular school, which at the moment is 70% Asian, so-called Asian, using this blanket category. Now, the campaign pits the idea of merit against the idea of critical race theory. They're saying we are being students are being brought here on the basis of what Nomani calls woke Inc., woke incorporated, and it really the mobilization had to do with the ideal of the American dream and hard work, industriousness, and so on. As most of you will know, this whole issue of Asian achievement at higher education level, but also K-12 school level, is a very it's a big issue in many quarters. So I'm going to leave it there because I'm running out of time. But I suppose to sum up what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to follow people who call themselves moderates, who say they want to resist the encroaching of the so-called woke ideology, wokeism, in the name of Enlightenment values. And so I think we need to pay attention to not just to the two far ends of the so-called culture wars, we also need to pay attention to the middle regions, the so-called moderates, but as we can see, there are some strange bedfellowships going on. It's by no means a clear-cut scenario, which is why it's perfect for ethnographic research. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, John. That was excellent. Well, I think from the far right to the moderate, we can now move on to more positive ways, or more groups that are using digital media in a more positive ways, I guess. So I'm very happy to invite here Lu Pin. Lu is joining us from New York. She's a co-founder of the Feminist Voices in China. And Lu, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
I will give keys. I will give the keys of feminist movement in China. Yeah, to explore, to show that how can we organize online campaign even in undemocratic country like China. Yeah. So the public space in China keeps being closed by our government since the current President Xi Jinping took power in 2017. So which has caused the shrink of civic activism in China. And the feminist movement now is mainly led by the young internet generation, still sticks to its critical stance and has been developed experienced tactics to mobilize the community in the harsh circumstance. First of all, I should give some background of this of my topic. First of all, in China, there is hardly any freedom of expression and association. So human rights defenders, including feminists, has been suffering from the harassment of the police, the persecution from the police for many years. And feminism is smeared as extremist as reaction for creating social unrest in the country, in the country. So it's very hard now for civic organizations to organize any offline events or public campaign for civil rights in China now. But on the other side, the good news, the good tendency is that now we have, I think perhaps we have millions of young people identifying themselves with feminism. Yeah. About 10 years ago, perhaps only hundreds of people identified themselves as feminists in China. But now we have a very wide community, and many composed by young people, young, well-educated, city-based young women who already made the decision that they won't endure the gender discrimination anymore, and they want to. They are very they are very eager to do something to fight against the discrimination and gender violence. I think most of them don't regard feminist movement as political opposition, but they definitely regard feminist movement as kind of social resistance. When many other social movements have been silenced by the government, feminist movement now is still very active in China, and mostly on the internet. But the public actually in China, both the public and private communications are subject to surveillance and censorship. The government know everything we are talking to the public, or or talking to our private friends. So it's very hard to transfer to spread the spread the information of feminism information or information or message of campaign to the public. But people now, these young people actually like their peers around the world. They are living on the internet, so they know very clearly about the censorship. So basically, the circumstance, our condition is that we're living on the internet, and we have to play with the censorship. We have no other options other than playing with, living together with the censorship. Yeah, but even in this situation, we are still seeking for any ways we can do to mobilize people, to educate people, which we think it's not only important to our feminist community, but also important to the future of our country, to the sustenance of the public space of this country. So since this, there are a group of feminist organizers. Most of them are living within China, and they are social workers. They are artists, and they are online business owners. They have to make their own living, make their own living by side works, and so that they can devote most of their time to feminist cause. I have been working together with them for many years, and I'm supporting them from the United States. So since this January, the beginning of this year, from the beginning of the pandemic, basically the Chinese people was expressing a very long time of total shutdown. Everything was locked down. No people can go out of their room. Yeah. So what we can do to respond to the pandemic. So that's it was a problem. This was a question we were thinking about when it appeared that we could not do anything. So because we are always looking for ways feminist perspective. We are always try to highlight feminist perspective, and we believe that the feminist perspective can do something to respond to the authority, which was reinforced by the excuse of public health protection. So at that time, two members of this team witnessed domestic violence in their neighborhood or in their family. So we realized that domestic violence, it actually was a very serious topic in under the pandemic. This was the first time we realized this issue would be so serious in that condition. So we decided that we should do something to respond to domestic violence. And we also started to know that the inaction of the police will be the most serious problem in that strange period. So but no, people could not go out, and the people were all very scared partly because of the pandemic, partly because I think people now in general, Chinese people are scared of any public participation, because which means trouble to your personal security somehow. So the first step is that we should reach out to our potential community. So what we did is to organize an online lecture about domestic violence. More than 100 people attended that lecture. Actually, our aim to organize that lecture was not just educating people, but to figure out where the potential participant or volunteers of our future campaign were. We assume that people listening to that lecture must be very interested to do something for domestic violence. So anyway, we had 1,000 people and 1,000 potential volunteers. So now we should give something to let them to do, and we should give them some tasks. And then those tasks should be very simple, very easy, and will not be so risky. Oh. Okay, so perhaps the last slide. I'm sorry, I forget the slide. Okay, anyway. Okay, so and again, the last one. I'm sorry. Yeah. So I'm sorry, the last one. So the first thing, it's weird. Anyway, so the second one, the next one, I'm confused. Yeah, right. The first thing we did was to we call for people to forward a single picture to their personal social media, which is not so public. So we call the picture was carried information about anti-domestic violence campaign. The second thing, about 2,000 people participated in that action. And the second action is that we ask people to transcript a prepared open letter and posted that letter to the public space of their neighborhood. Again, hundreds of people participated in this action, and many of them posted the picture to the internet, to the social media. And many of them told us that they were very afraid, they were scared when they occupied the public space, when they went out of their room, their apartment, and occupied the public space with the anti-domestic violence messages. And the third task is that we designed a booklet with anti-domestic violence topic. And we invite people to give address to us, and we will mail this booklet to any address they provided. So basically, people can provide the address of their abusive boyfriend, of their abusive bosses, and local police. So we will mail these booklets to to those people. So we launched a temporary online store, and the only goods in that store is a service to waiting these booklets. We mailed more than 2,000 booklets to different addresses around the country. Yeah. So what we achieved within 2.5 months, from January, from the March to the middle of the May, we actually media, many media and the public start talking about domestic violence. And yes, and we highlight the visibility, the power of feminist community when everything is is increasingly silenced by the government. And we are organizing. We keep organizing. We use this opportunity to organizing our community again. And we through this campaign, actually, we are also preparing for our next campaign. And in the middle of May, after we have been working together for 2.5 months, the platform we created for this campaign was banned by the government without any clear reason. So, but fortunately, we have been working for so long time together. And several months later, when the pandemic spread out across the world, we are so happy that we can share our experience to the world through the report of United Nations, through some influential media like New York Times. So this is the first example of the feminist campaign, online campaign in China. About another case, actually, is still going on. About 3 weeks ago, a Tibetan divorced woman was bound by her ex-husband in a very remote mountain village. The name of this Tibetan woman is Lam. Actually, Lam is a poor woman struggling for the living of herself and her family every day, and she is also a popular Weblog with hundreds of thousands followers on Douyin. And she shared her daily life. She shared her happiness and her harshness of her life. And actually, the followers witnessed her last moment when then in the night when she was broadcasting from her kitchen, her ex-husband rushed into her house and burned her with oil. Yeah, several days after that incident, tragedy, Lam died in the hospital. And people were extremely shocked by this tragedy. Some of my friends cannot stop crying. But what we can do, this is our obligation. This is the obligation of feminist organizers. So the first time we launched a very simple poster to internet, and with the slogan "Stop Inaction." Why? Because we use this slogan because actually Lam reported her ex-husband to the police for many times, but she never got real response. All the response she got was like, "This is family, so and we cannot do it. We cannot do much to help you." This is a response from the police. So we think that it's the inaction of the police caused this tragedy, and the police should be taken accountable. So after we launched this very simple poster to internet. So many people transported it. So many angry people transported it. And so this is the first time, and eventually after the anti-domestic violence law was enforced in China, 4 years after the enforcement of the domestic violence law, eventually we see the elephant in room out, the key factor of the domestic violence is the inaction of the police. And we also organize some events to mourn Lam, and we posted the pictures to the internet. You can see that all the events were organized in the evening, because now it's dangerous to organize this kind of open events in the daytime in China. But that's not all. That's not all. We should look for another way to transfer the anger to activism. But the situation is it's harder than several months ago. For example, we are thinking that perhaps we can organize some petition, but actually almost all the tools to organize, to collect the signatures were already bound in China. And perhaps our information will be censored before people can read. So I won't expose our future plan, but we definitely will do something in next month. And I believe that our anti-domestic violence campaign will start a new stage at the price of Lam's and many other women's deaths. So here's some of my final messages. So first of all, that social movement now is uncentralized, but the core organizers and the collective activism agenda is always very important to transfer anger to real social change. And we should always reach out to people by accessible should try accessible way to reach out to people, to our community, and we should give people something to do. We should give people the plan that to let them know what they can do. Yeah. And we should give evidence. We don't have evidence because we don't have resource to conduct statistics, to conduct research. But we have evidence. We have story. We have data from our work, our grassroots work. So we can use those data and evidence and stories as evidence to educate people. And I think the public space, when the public space is increasingly closed, actually I think we can still have our voice. Yeah, that's very important. And finally, I celebrate what feminists in China and around the world are doing. We are important to the world.
Thank you so much, Lou. It has been fascinating, and it's been also really nice to conclude with something so happy and positive. Thank you so much. So we will now move on to our last speakers, who are not directly with us, but they have sent us their fantastic video. Stefania Milan from the University of Amsterdam and Emiliano Treré from the University of Cardiff have put together video on their project called COVID-19 and the Margins, and I'm sure you will love it, because basically it's a video that will give you exactly the tools on how to mobilize digitally. So with that, we're going to play the video for you. Thank you.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, good evening, wherever you are in this very strange COVID time. I assume we are all in different time zones. My name is Stefania Milan, and I work at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm here with my colleague
Emiliano Treré from Cardiff University, the School of Journalism, Media and Culture.
So because we cannot be with you in person tomorrow, we thought we might record the intervention. Instead of doing actually two separate interventions, given we have spent the last 3-4 years working intensively together, we decided to make this into a more interactive conversation about a project and some lines of research that really are very close to our heart. So we are both interested in social movements, in digital activism in particular, in the intersection between what we may call the data-fied society, so the society as it becomes more and more intertwined with processes of datification and mass surveillance and the computational turn, and everything around it. So how do people organize in this new technological setting, and how do they respond to challenges? What are the challenges on the one hand, but also on the other, what are the opportunities offered by this new, let's say, socio-technical system for grassroots activists? And the project that I would like to introduce before giving the word to Emiliano is called, well, there are in fact two projects. It's called Big Data from the South, but then there is a spillover, which is very much in line with the emergency of the day, COVID, the COVID pandemic. And the spin-off project is COVID-19 from the margins. First of all, before telling you what this is about, we want to say, well, we want to spend a couple of words to explain why this matters. So digital activism is, it's been, in the hands of social movements, in the toolbox of social movements for several years by now, several decades, in fact. But our ways of talking about this phenomena, our ways of studying it, the majority of the case study that we have available also for our students to read, for example, really come from the Western world, the Western center epistemic centers, and in a situation in which we keep quoting a handful or a dozen, if you want, of scholars, amazing scholars, don't get me wrong, but really living in the dark a lot of scholarships simply because it might emerge in the wrong side of the country or of the hemisphere, or simply because it's not written in English, the lingua franca of academia. So that's how we set up in 2017 already, well before COVID, of course, to try to rethink the methodological, but especially epistemological and theoretical tenets that are part of our scholarly toolbox. And the idea really was to try to decolonize all of that. So make room on the one hand for diversity, make room for the linguistic diversity, enable people who are not on the spotlight to actually speak about their story. And then also, of course, relate with a scholarship that might not be the classic scholarship that we're familiar with. And this is how Big Data from the South was born. And that's how then later COVID-19 from the margins was born. How does it have to do with, given we speak so much about data specifically, with the overall topic of today, which is social movements and digital activism? Well, on the one hand, we believe that, in fact, the ecosystem around social movements is changing, with more and more availability of data, but of course also more options for surveilling and repressing social movements. So movements of any type are progressively making sense of these challenges and these opportunities. And secondly, we do believe that what we're talking about, the need to decolonize and de-Westernalize scholarship applies to not just the study of data, for example, of COVID, but of course, to the study of the experience of social movements more in general. So these are projects that are an academic side and a more applied side. You can see them online. We are going to pass on to you later the URLs, but if you Google Big Data from the South or Big Data Sur in the sort of Spanish version, you should be able to find it. And same with COVID from the margin, which is a subdomain, if you want, to Big Data from the South. And in both cases, so we have blogs. So we have two different multilingual blogs. We're going to get back to that later on the importance of going multilingual, even when ourselves actually cannot fully understand what we publish. And secondly, we have, of course, also, because at the end of the day, we are also academics judged and on the basis of what we published and willing, of course, to contribute theory development. We also published a special issue called Big Data from the South of the peer-reviewed journal Television in New Media. And the second special issue is on the working with the trilingual journal, Colombian journal Palabra Clave, where we want to explore Latin American perspectives on datification and AI. Without further ado, we would like to, there's a lot that can be said about these projects. And we're learning ourselves, right? So by trial and error, by not being funded sometimes, we're going to say something about that later as well. But we want to share with you some of the concepts that we are working with and on as part of this attempt to de-Westernize and decolonize the way we think about digital activism. The first is you're thinking about and theorizing the margins. And the second is data poverty. And after that, we are going to share really our experience, put it on the table, including our mistakes, our errors, our difficulties, so that we can all learn together in this grand experiment of de-Westernizing the way we do research. So I now pass the word to Emiliano.
Yeah, thank you, Stefania. And thanks for having us, actually, and to be able to talk about this. We really think this is an appropriate space to share these insights, to share these experience, and to share these modus operandi, the way we're doing things, as Stefania was saying, a trial and error, but also an incredibly learning experience for us. Theoretically, the whole idea that is behind the Big Data from the South initiative is an idea of course, of Souths, as in the plural. So we're talking about different sites of struggle that can be found in the North as well as in the South. So it's something that transcends geographical barriers. It's something that is rich and plural, or pluriversal, to use an Arturo Escobar terminology. And this links to the spin-off of this Big Data from the South initiative, which, as Stefania was saying, is the COVID from the Margins blog, multilingual blog platform. And we use the metaphor and the notion and the lens of the margins, because the margins is, in the word of Clemente Rodriguez, citizen media scholar, is used here as a kind of a shortcut to speak of dynamics of power inequality, asymmetrical access to material and symbolic resources that shape access, unequal access to the public sphere. So they are sites of struggles where the challenges of, for example, datification, but also of the digital in general, unfold in ways that might be distinct from the mainstream, but also where particular digital ecologies and original territories, I might say, and landscape take shape, right? Where they emerge and they thrive, with their creativity, where the different unpredictability of these practices, of these dynamics originate, right? So thinking in this way, COVID and datification and digital activism from the margins means having a different mindset of this and being open to a different set of questions, of stories, of experiences, and amplifying a different set of voices. And of course, being open to a different set of challenges and a different set of risks in a way, and in the process, in the story, in all these different kind of things that are happening. And for us, this notion is a really powerful way to open up horizons or understanding regarding the margins. It's not a notion that closes down the debate, but instead, or that labels the debate, or that silos, in kind of boxes, conceptual boxes, but instead it's something that opens up horizons of knowledge and understandings, also in direction which we ourselves didn't really contemplate at the beginning. It's something that we are learning every day throughout this complex process in relation to big data from the South, and in relation to COVID from the margins more specifically. So, and also it's an interesting lens, because reflecting on data, power, resistance, digital activism, as it unfolds in the global South, it cannot be separated from thinking about oppression, inequality, as these processes are interwoven with datafication, vulnerable population in the global North. In fact, we link and we connect the two in the platforms and in the resulting book, open access book, that will come out of this great experience. So these are two interwoven, connected agendas, all right? So, and of course, this is one of the notion that we want to add to the conceptual vocabulary to think about this kind of phenomena. It's not the only one, and they can be combined, they can be adapted, they can be kind of adapted to different contexts where they unfold. Another interesting one, which directly relates to the concept of the margins, is a concept we have worked on in another article that was in another special issue, not edited by us, but by Adrian Russell and Matt Powers, on COVID and media, where we have this small intervention which centers on data poverty. And Stefania can elaborate a bit more on this other notion that it's part of this palette, of this repertoire of terminology to understand this reality.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emiliano. Yeah, in the attempt to make sense of COVID as the grand challenge of our times for social movements, but also for the constituencies that compose social movements often, but also that social movements might work for, we realize that there is really hardly enough talk of inequality. So in the moment in which a pandemic, a global pandemic, hits so close to home, you know, we are Italian, Emiliano and I, so it's besides China, of course, Italy was one of the first countries in the West that were hit by the pandemic. And what we could see in the coverage, what we could see in also the policy responses to all of this, is that in the moment in which this disease, this virus hit so close to home, so close to, I mean, like it affects nearly every family, or potentially every family, the issue, the grand agenda of inequality and social justice are completely sidelined. Why? Because if the rich, let's say, or the lucky ones might get sick, of course, society has no time, or even less time, to think about those that are actually excluded from a lot of these measures. So society cares less for those in need, because they have to care for more people in a way. This is in no way, of course, a justification. But then we cycle back to thinking about certain very interesting concepts that we work with, because they are quite popular and quite effective. For example, the notion of surveillance capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, or even more so the notion of data colonialism by Nick Holdry and Ulysses Mejia. In both cases, what the authors, and I'm trying to collide together two notions which are actually quite different from where, the starting point, but also the main argument that they make. But what they have in common is that essentially they start from a very Western standpoint. Western meaning humans, or subjects are rich or sufficiently well off that they can take care of their privacy. Meaning privacy becomes a concern of course, only when you have food on the table, when you have an income, when you can feed your children, and when you have a job, right? It's in a way almost like a luxury activism, right? But because very often when we write our books, when we come up with our concepts, we are ourselves situated in the West, of course, it might happen that concepts like data colonialism, although they have a very progressive agenda, they end up obscuring the issue of social justice. What we observe, in particular in relation to the pandemic, in relation to COVID, is that whereas Emiliano and I, for example, or most of us in this audience probably can afford or want to be invisible to the state, or can afford to be invisible to the state and the corporate powers behind the tech corporations. Therefore, we nurture our privacy, we try to protect it. We want to not be seen, at least not too much. A lot of other people don't have this luxury in a way. And that's how we identify we got to think about the notion of data poverty. So often when we talk about big data, for example, an important distinction back in 2012 by Dana Boyd and Crawford was a distinction between the big data rich and the so-called have-nots, those that don't have access to big data themselves, or the software to analyze big data to make sense and capitalize the power of big data. Now, 2019, actually, still today, only 53% of the world population, according to the International Telecommunication Union, has access to the internet. So these are the numbers that we think about when we think about the divide, for example, or these are the notions that we mobilize when we think, hey, you can be, capitalize, make sense of big data. You cannot, therefore I have not, or you can defend your privacy. You're not able to, but sometimes being able to defend your privacy is actually a luxury that many don't have. Hence the data poor. A very good example of data poor is, for example, we come from Europe, or at least we speak to you from Europe, are the so-called undocumented migrants. So people who, come into the European Union in an illegal, apologies for the term, it's not our favorite term, of course, but in an illegal manner. And therefore, they might want to be invisible to the state, because the state, being visible to the state, being detected means actually deportation, for example, means repression, means being internalized in detention camps, means being brought back where your journey started from, with all the problems that this might originate. Yet, in times of COVID, if you are a migrant, therefore invisible to the state, and you get sick, you can actually not afford to be invisible, because visibility, being visible in the COVID counting, for example, means access to care. And these are listed in most of the European Union, where there is, somewhat of a public healthcare system, or at least a universal healthcare system. So for us, for example, undocumented migrants are the new data poor. And in a moment in which policymakers increasingly rely on what we may call calculated publics, so a public, an audience, a citizenry, that is brought to life and made sense of through numbers, you might actually want to be in the number. And if you're not, this means that you don't have the right to vaccine, you don't have the right to go to the hospital, and so on and so forth. So essentially, being datafied during a pandemic that is visible to the state has turned into a sort of essential condition of survival and care. So this new type of data poverty, of not being visible to the state, of course, has to do with very fundamental inequalities that predate the rise of big data, but it is aggravated by the limited citizen agency in this increasingly complex data extractivism system. So we elaborate further the notion of data poverty in the article that Emiliano already mentioned. It's called The Rise of the Data Poor, and then something else. It's open access, and I invite you to have a look if you want to know more. We continue actually working on these notions, that just a little stepping stone, especially when you think through your own experience, by the way, your own very situated experience in difficult times like a pandemic. It might take more time to elaborate concepts, but this is what we thought we want to offer it nonetheless, also to, for our colleagues to help us improve it. And that's with this, I guess it's time to tell you more about our project. As Emiliano mentioned, it's going to be soon an open access book. So it was a blog, and now it's going to be a book. So Emiliano, if you want to share what are the main tenets of the book. We have 74 authors.
Sure, that was, 74 authors is a bit of, wow, crazy amount of author to manage in a book. I remember myself telling last year that I wouldn't edit another edited book in my whole academic career. And of course, these are the kind of promises that you make and you break when something interesting comes along the way, and it's just, of course, a broken promise. But this was something different. So this is an experience of accounting for different stories and different voices of the pandemic as it unfolds. And then, so the book is a different things because it sort of crystallizes these stories into a multilingual format. We're going to talk in a second about what it means to have their voices in their original language, in the language of choice of the people, of the communities, and to have a book that just does this kind of documenting and in an open access way, in a free way, and in a different kind of unorthodox way, especially for us academic that are used to, to write in the lingua franca of English, the same language we're speaking with you now, and so on and so forth. And in trying to kind of build a backbone, a conceptual backbone of the book into themes, because, these kind of blogs were sort of raining on us when we opened the call, and then there was this continuous process of refining, entering into contact, this fantastic relationship that is forged through the process. We have some really interesting themes, like key themes around which the book is structured and the project in general. And first of all, the question of the issue of counting at the time of a pandemic and invisibilities, human invisibilities. So of course, this connects to what Stefania was saying, for example, on the contribution that explored condition of invisibility that, for example, affect migrant population. So all these concerns about just data management that apply to populations on the move, and how it's different, and how it plays out for for migrant population, and all the different regimes of data visualization and their implication for data management, with a different author pointing out how local communities, they make sense of data, they build collective learning experiences in the process. So this provides this kind of rationale in the project for how to give voice to communities whose vulnerability results in particular needs for visibility and visualization, and some kind of more specific visualization that are not the classic traditional visualization perpetuated by mainstream media or outlets, for example, that counter visualization that are needed to outline specific needs of specific population. I'm thinking also about feminist data visualization and how we can give visibility to statistic on impact of COVID on domestic violence and education. Many examples that we have received in many different groups, and what it means and which kind of care should be paid to represent that kind of vulnerability. Thinking about children from families that are affected from poverty and subsequent data poverty, precariousness, as well as communities working in the formal sector affected by the pandemic, need to make themselves visible to the state, because in this way they can become recipients of social policy measures such as subsidies that are vital in this kind of situation, that are absolutely vital. I'm thinking about the UK here a lot as well. Through multiple narratives, we have sort of these global scenario of how people strive and communities to be visible when they lack many of the resources that Stefania was talking about, and that's one of the key problems, right? So that's one of the main most important things, but this is connected to a set of perpetuated vulnerabilities and inequalities. So that it's another central tenet of the book, how situation of vulnerability affecting these communities are particularly exacerbated by COVID. You know, situations that are already on the edge, and now actually COVID pushes this to the limit and beyond. You know, the struggles of LGBTQ plus community, and well, that's one of the of course affected communities. The prejudice. We have a lot of workers of the digital economy, and here, I mean, we have seen in many reports how the workers of the gig economy around the world, and in particular, we have experiences from the global south, and we got from Brazil and all that, are particularly affected because they are the ones who cannot disconnect. They are the ones who have to be on the field. They are the ones who need to be delivering. Otherwise, with so many people in those kind of precarious conditions, it's a privilege to actually being able to work from home. It's a privilege to go fully digital, and so on and so forth. So what are the consequences for these already precarious workforce? And so all the contradiction, all the problems of this already affected workforce are brought to the fore, and they are at the center of many of the contribution. The perpetuation of inequalities under the pandemic and the reinforcement in policy and redistributional response measures along these lines. So in times of this global crisis, ordinary measure of social assistance acquire a special importance, because for the one affected, the narratives of perpetuated vulnerability and inequality unfolding under the pandemic, they become crucial. They highlight critical situations that require kind of ad hoc specific forms of intervention to limit the profound socioeconomic impacts of this health emergency. And this has been highlighted by many. This connects, of course, to the question of datafied social policies. It is strictly connected to this, because as national lockdowns took hold the civil society, vulnerable groups, including below the poverty line household, refugees, internal displaced persons, and so on and so forth, and all these gig economy and informal sector workers, they have been disproportionately affected by the crisis. So we got stories from Argentina, Colombia, India, Spain, and that highlight the importance of social policies during the emergency. So we have different country case, but we have common denominators. So the importance of information in devising social protection policy, and the fact that datification reifies existing determination of entitlements and exposes consequences of making social assistance conditional to strict entitlement criteria. So some of the distortion and biases on these criteria are exposed further by the COVID situation and the COVID crisis. And the second themes point to the consequences of making social welfare conditional to digital identity when vulnerability is heightened by the crisis. And here the example in India stands out strongly among this. So these are some of the question and the matter in relation to datafied social polities and how the priority are somehow reshuffled by the crisis. And finally, of course, the theme that we started with, pandemics, what we call pandemic solidarities. Maybe not the best choice. I mean, just, but you know, you have your own notion and your own kind of jargon, and activism and resistance from below. So all these different narratives of how digital activism all over the world has thrived and reconfigured due to COVID. How digital activism during the pandemic is exploiting, somehow leveraging the new affordances of platforms, and now vulnerable groups are able to build solidarity even in these pandemic times, no, with many continuities and other kind of ruptures, you know, and innovation as well. So we document those innovation as well, and we document the challenges of doing and carrying out digital activism in COVID times. You know, the digital march of the Desaparecidos mother in Mexico, an amazing kind of examples, our symbolic power in COVID times that makes the most of the digital in these particular difficult times where physical contact is many times impossible or highly dangerous. So new facet of activism, new challenges, continuities and disruptions, and new forms of data activism as well, and resistance to algorithms. So this is the backbone of the book in terms of as you can see, every theme is intimately related to each other. That's in this constellation of themes. And now, you know, Stefania is going to talk about the process, which I think is as important, if not more important, than actually the topics that we cover, and especially from a militant kind of anthropology, for a militant engagement that this network is actually nurturing and relies upon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emiliano, for taking us through the many contributions. I've counted authors, but actually not even the chapter, the number of chapters, but there are many. And the good news is that it's open access, so it's going to be with you very soon and for free. But yeah, a note on process. So we believe this book is specialist in 3 ways, and the book reflects, of course, the blog and the entire initiative. But I want to start from actually saying that, well, this is in particular the COVID from the margins project, I mean, spin-off, if you want, and then the blog and the book. Include also third person development and ICT for the scholar, Silvia Maziero, who joined Emiliano and me in this adventure. But besides the fact that we are luckily, we still have a salary from our universities, this project hardly got any funding. And it was kind of funny because we approached on this time of the pandemic. There's many calls for events, for you name it. So we actually pitched our project in a few occasions, and we were told we were either too international, or we were not artistic enough, or you name it. But essentially what we got back is that, okay, this doesn't exist yet as a funding, as a budget line. Definitely there's need for it. So we got an extra motivation to push through, although there was hardly any funding, which is also, I mean, the reason why I mention it is because we do believe there's so much that can be done without money. Then when you actually bring together a project like a book, then the money starts slowly coming in. So luckily we can print enough copies, we hope, to spread it across. And we went, of course, for a publisher, the Amsterdam-based Institute of Natural Cultures, in their Theory on Demand series, which is open access by default, so they don't charge us. But yeah, it was, I mean, if you wonder why your project sometimes don't get funded, well, you're in good company, unfortunately. And when we got some money, though, and at the beginning it was about 1,500 euros, or in the realm of that, we decided to use it for sponsoring. I mean, to support for supporting authors. in need. And we tell you how, so, and why this is so important for us. But so going back to the process, 3 main points. The book is a multilingual conversation as the blog and as the community. And there are 2 main reasons behind this unusual choice. First, of course, we wanted to celebrate and acknowledge diversity, including linguistic and cultural diversity. And this is also because linguists have long recognized that language is much more than just a system of conventional signs that we use to, call 3 a 3, but it harbors a certain view of the world. So allowing everyone, and we are all very situated as authors and as activists, to, from wherever we are, to pick our preferred language to join the conversation is for us a way to gain access to each and every different perspective, unique perspective on the world. It's also a way to practice, as Mignolos wrote in 2011, a sort of epistemic disobedience, questioning the primacy of the Euro-Western-centric episteme, really decentering predominant ways of being of knowing. Recently, there was a great article published by a media scholar, Anna Cristina Susina from Loughborough University in the UK, but originally from Latin America. We invite you to take a look because it really condenses a lot of our discussion as well in a much better way than we could ever write it. But essentially, she calls out English as the lingua franca of the academic debate, which is, of course, very practical, but it is also, and I quote, a filter that strongly limits the encounters between Western theory and scientific cultures rooted in our languages, other languages, sorry. So we really want to try with this book, with this project, to participate in this exercise of decentering our ways of knowing and decentering also ourselves as scholars and as activists in an historical moment in which the first very global disease of the datafied society keeps being reported or have from Western-centric angles. Emiliano already mentioned Arturo Escobar, an anthropologist that you might know, and his amazing book, Designs for Pluriverse. And of course, we are also very much inspired by his perspective. I mean, he talks about the pluriverse as a word where many words fit. And so we want to make space in this project for all these many words, including when, as I said, ourselves, we cannot actually edit a text because we have no clue about what it really says. And this brings me to the second reason why we wanted to go multilingual, which is to actually make readers, including ourselves, experience firsthand what individuals and communities at the margins undergo on a regular basis, which is discomfort. I mean, the fact that you have to read or you fail to understand text in a language and worldview which is not your own. So, for example, even in cases when the blog post, so we have a text in original language and in translation. In some cases, authors were able to do that because, of course, we have no money to do translations ourselves, but we decided to put in the book the original language. So the book currently is in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese. And we decided to leave, wherever we have an English text, it is available simply on the web. Second point, why we think our book and this project is so special. And again, we offer this for, inspiring similar projects or seeing whether you have similar projects to suggest us for us to learn from them, is the fact that it embraces the twisted time of the pandemic. So the blog started in May 2020, and then we are including contributions that got to us basically till yesterday, in fact, till October, so mid-October 2020. So different phases of the pandemic in a sort of instant history that speaks of fear and uncertainties as they happen, as the authors themselves make sense of it, but also of hope and collective organizing. And as they happen, as I said. So in the twisted time of the pandemic, where everything is accelerated, everything is very slow. I mean, the limbo, not seeing friends or family is low, but then everything, like, the numbers of the pandemic are accelerated, the death, the spread of the virus is accelerating and all of that. So in these very abnormal times, we decided to live, to remove all the indication of the time in which the texts were written, to give access to a sort of history in the making, what do we mean? Certain narratives, for example, of stories about an instance of activism. So how do you organize, for example, Emiliano already mentioned it. So I'm going to go with the same example. But so if you are a group of mothers of disappeared people, so children in a given country, and you used to demonstrate live, so to go in front of, for example, government building. How do you move on with the pandemic? How do you actually, translate your struggle for the pandemic times? So that specific article, for example, was sent to us very early on. And then maybe if you would have read it in July, where things seem to be quieter and a bit more rosy, it might have sounded a bit naive even, right? But then now, all of a sudden, with the numbers going up again, these examples become relevant. So we want to have this sort of narrative of the history on the making that takes stock of the twisted time of the pandemic itself, or the abnormal times that we're living. And finally, we want to really try to nurture this distinct type of conversation and a distinct, very special community of practice. So you're going to see when the book comes out that, in fact, we did not use the usual legitimacy mechanisms that we use in academia. So you include someone in a book if they hold a doctorate, or if you're studying towards one, or the basis of seniority, fame, age index, citations, whatever, reputation. Actually, what we did, we issue a call for paper, for contributions, and we disregarded completely even the quality of the writing. Meaning, you're going to see a text in the end that makes sense, but in several cases, especially when we work with junior authors, with activists who don't really write normally, or in English, for example, or with people with whom writing for a blog is a bit of an unusual experience. Well, we spent hours and hours and sleepless nights trying to help them to shape their story in a way that could be presented. So that's why we ended up with a broad panorama of distinct authors that you might never heard of, but we promise you the stories that they bring with them and their situated experience are truly amazing. And this was made possible also because we decided to allocate the little money that we received from our universities towards a small contributor fees paid to the authors in need. So authors from the Global South, but also authors in the West that are unemployed, or casual workers, or they are activists, or you name it. So, of course, as always, this is our own selections. It reflects our network. It reflects, the fact that even that in a way these authors are the lucky ones, in the sense that besides being hit like anyone else by the pandemic, they at least had the chance to write. Many others, they had to struggle with very basic needs, and they couldn't even, put their thoughts on writing. But we wanted to, give a sense of how a process like this might look like. Yes, it is time consuming, but it is also extremely rewarding, and the result is soon going to be in your desk. And it is, so follow us, because we are going to ship via traditional post copies of the book, besides the book, of course, being made available as a digital copy and print on demand in case you have your own printing service. But so this is what we had to share with you today. If Emiliano, you want to add something?
Well, thanks. I think this covers the process and the topics. I was going to say that this covers basically all things digital, and of course in relation to the datafied society more specifically, and then of course relevant to people working in digital activism and so on. But we reach beyond actually the kind of barriers of these disciplines, also to go and touch other themes like astronomy. I mean, there is an engagement with a beautiful project that they're doing in Brazil of a different kind of astronomy in relation to ethnography, and astronomy in relation to a different kind of ways of seeing and making sense of the sky. So under a different sky, you know, in that kind of mindset and ethos that somehow resonates with what we are doing. So we have, and this signals a sort of going beyond of the network and of coding from the margins to touch other kinds of sensibilities of communities that are affected by COVID. And it is related to data somehow, but it goes beyond that. But for us, it was a way to learn about something different, about something that also we didn't know about, and to make a connection that wouldn't have been possible without this project. So as Stefania was saying, I mean, this is something that we are in it for because we have enthusiasm and passion for what we're doing. And this, of course, connects to the fact that, you know, we also do it because, I don't know, we are academic, but we're also activists. And this is something that just feels right and feels also incredibly rewarding as a process, and many things that you can learn and then can't wait to apply, possibly with some more funding next time, and possibly with the strange thing that we were called. It was the first time in my whole career that I've been called too international. Usually is the reason why I have progressed in academia, being really international, and Stefania too. So for us, it was like, I mean, should we tone this down? I mean, what does this mean? We're like, but yeah, of course, this is a provocation, but it also makes you think, makes you see how actually funding agency works sometimes with like predetermined categories, right? So that is something to think about. And yeah, stay.
I guess we leave you to the prosecution of your conversations, and we are going to send to the organizers of this beautiful session all the links for your proposal. But of course, the door is open in case you want to yourself contribute, because COVID, unfortunately, is not over yet, but especially the margins, the disempowered really need our attention and our voice as well.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Thank you, and a big, you know, ciao to all the other panelists and friends, to John and Alex, and to Mina's organizing this, and to the whole network. Thanks a lot, and we are reachable, and yeah, please do contribute. Consider contributing to this. Thank you very much. Cheers. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you so much. If Emiliano and Stefania will be watching later the recordings, thank you so much, guys, for putting this project together. Now, I think we've had absolutely fascinating roundtable of fantastic speakers, from Alex talking about how the far right is organizing online, which is ever so important to understand how and what they do in order to tackle them, actually. To John, who was talking about the woke culture politics, and I found it particularly fascinating because I think specifically this liberal middle line is often forgotten and underestimated in a sense, and how they connect exactly to the spread of the far right more generally. And it was absolutely amazing listening to Lou and also Emiliano and Stefania on how we can actually organize and how to use the digital world to tackle all the social, political, economic issues that we're facing, not only and how to use digital media, not only in the global north, but also in the rest of the world. So thank you all of you. Now we are running very short of time, and I was amazed how many fantastic questions there are in the chat, which we won't unfortunately have time to answer all of them right now, but we will create all the platforms in the near future so that all this discussion is definitely continuing. And so for now, I have one question from the chat to each speaker. So if we can maybe start with Alex. For Alex, there was a question. I'd be interested to hear Alex's observation in terms of the main differences between pre-internet and contemporary transitions in a social movement from radicalism, with or without legitimate grievances, to violent extremism and terrorism in particular. I would love to know his opinion on how face-to-face versus digital recruitment comparatively affects leadership structuration, and so on. Alex.
Thanks. Thanks first of all to all the participants and speakers and organizers. If I don't get a chance to say that again, it's been a great event. I'll try to be quick on this. I think it's a great question. To be honest, the more that I read and study about social movements broadly, but about the far right specifically, the more I'm convinced that that we see cycles in terms of the way movement activity works. And I think there's often too much made of the transition to online activism as if it has entirely replaced earlier forms of mobilization, recruitment, propagandizing. And in fact, the history of the far right, and especially the fascist far right in North America, demonstrates that like there's not an uninterrupted continuity in tactics and strategy, but a very concerted model that has been accelerated, I think, and deepened in online platforms, but hasn't superseded earlier forms of movement building. But I think, like in my talk, what I point to with the example of Savannah Rath and Gamble and the would-be attack on the Halifax shopping center is that what the internet has made possible is the proliferation of these ideas and ways of organizing and like explosive, unexpected violence in ways that before would have required more commitment and buy-in from prospective movement members. And I think that is a big difference. So in many ways, we're seeing a recapitulation of the kind of culture war model that was innovated by many far-right vanguardists in the early 1990s when this model was first built, when they were confronting the reality that you know, state intervention and like popular culture had sort of superseded earlier forms of activism. But the things they were doing then are much of what they're doing now. Only platforms allow for real-time communication, radicalization, especially that like encouragement of that kind of emotional buy-in, that affective commitment that social media platforms really accelerate and nurture. So I think that's one of the key differences, that kind of like emotional buy-in that you can get in terms of being on Facebook, Twitter, you know, other social media platforms that you can't get from reading a zine or being a passive observer on an earlier you know, form of internet-based communication. So I'll just leave it at that. I think you know, we're seeing accelerations, not qualitative differences in forms of movement organizing, and I think we need to pay attention to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Alex. My next question will be aimed at John. There is a comment for him in a chat saying, "It is interesting that online campaigns, be they against new farm law, violence against women, or campaigns in support of the state of arrest that have taken place, have also increased since the pandemic. Assembly outside is becoming difficult to people who are in the liberal camp, and they're more active on digital platforms." I don't know, John, if you just maybe can elaborate on this comment. Thank you.
Yes, that's certainly happening from the people I've been following. Yes, COVID, the pandemic certainly has had an impact when it comes to limiting the offline offline campaigning. On the other hand, I think the nature of the public I've been looking at, I think it's important that we don't lump everyone together, that we don't talk too generally about the online and the offline. So in this case, this particular public, because it's Twitter centric and because it's very much based on conversations, there are lots of very lengthy conversations via podcasts, via YouTube channels, which I mentioned. And something that I didn't mention is the importance of Twitter threads as well. So on the whole, this public I was talking about will continue to be, I think for the time being, Twitter centered and more online than offline. But having said that, some of for example, the school campaign I mentioned at the TJ Thomas Jefferson High School in Virginia, that had a very interesting dynamic whereby some of the mostly Asian parents who organized a protest, a physical protest, at the same time were tweeting and saying, well, the other protest from people who want to change the system was AstroTurf. So those kinds of back and forth dynamics can have, will often have an offline dimension, but less so during COVID. And I think it's important to think in terms not just of the hybrid media system, to use Chadwick's term, but also the hybrid communication system, in that sometimes some of the very important communication that goes on is not mediated. Not everything is digitally mediated or is mediated through non-digital means. At the moment with COVID, it's more online than it would have been a few months ago, but depending on what you're looking at, the impact may not have been so big. So for these particular people, COVID hasn't been as big as impact as for other publics, if you like.
Fantastic, thank you. Guys, just to let you know, we have 4 minutes left until the session will be cut off, unfortunately. But I have one more question for Lou. If there was a question on what are the challenges in bridging information circulation between approved and banned social media platforms in China. Lou, if you can maybe give it a minute or two before we say goodbye.
It's very hard and sometimes risky to bridge information from within China and out of China. And you know, the Great Firewall actually not only stopped people within China knowing something, it also blocked people out of China from knowing what is happening within China. Actually, we bring what we do now is that we create a social media account on Twitter and Facebook, and also those social medias in China. But basically, we posted different kind of information in different styles to satisfy English-speaking people and the Chinese people. Yeah, it's hard, but we are trying.
Yeah. Thanks, Lou. I am really fascinated by the work you're doing. So we have a few more minutes left to say goodbye. I want to say a huge thank you to all the speakers. Thank you so much for getting up early for us, for finding the time for us. And also the audience, thank you so much for all your great questions. The chat has really become kind of live on its own, and we will make sure that all the speakers will get your questions and the comments, and we will find a way how to continue this conversation. And the same also applies to the keynote speech from Marianne yesterday. I also want to invite you for the last session of our WWNA 2020 online event, which is going to be at 1:30 Central European Time, and it's a meeting of the Applied Anthropology Network members, but everyone is invited. So thank you so much. Yeah, I think this is it. And of course, in case somebody doesn't know, this is just a amazing pre-tasting menu of the event we are planning for the spring 2021. So keep an eye on our events. And again, thank you so much, guys. Thank you, everyone. Lou, John, Alex, Emiliano, Stefania, if you're watching later. Thank you so much.
Okay, just a very quick notice in the end. Thank you, Mina. You've said it all. Maybe see you in the meeting. We will have to close the room now because there will be the meeting in about 20 minutes. But I also wanted to say one more time that we will definitely also save the chat. Thank you, everyone, for the really, really interesting inputs in the chat. So we will save it. And if you are registered, we have your email address, so we can send you all the materials that we collected during the session. So thank you so much, everyone.